Perhaps give us a little bit more context on these demonstrations. There have been various rounds of demonstrations since the war began over the last 10 months, but it feels as though sentiment and public anger is a different level with the ones that we saw yesterday.
I think you're exactly right, and this could be attributed to a perfect storm of public fatigue and shock that's really crested over the weekend with the discovery of the bodies of 6 hostages, which Israel says were executed by their Hamas captors in the Gaza Strip shortly before they could be reached or rescued by Israeli forces. Now, such incidents have happened before during this war. The Israelis are familiar with this sort of tragedy, and they've certainly weathered to a war which has had pretty much wall-to-wall public support. The reason this time the protests appear to be cresting, and this may actually be a tipping point in the war in terms of domestic support for the government and its conduct, is the fact that it now emerges that when the hostages were killed, according to a forensic examination, was pretty much exactly when Netanyahu's security cabinet, a small decision-making forum, was meeting late on Thursday night and voted to approve his decision to not give way on certain key concessions that Hamas has demanded on its side of the truce talks. So many of the public are angry at Netanyahu, wondering if indeed these hostages might have been saved had that decision not gone through on Thursday night.
Yeah, Dan and you and I have had many discussions over the course of the last few weeks about those ceasefire negotiations. And one of the latest principles that Netanyahu has been sticking to is that he would like to maintain a presence along that Philadelphia corridor. How likely is it after this latest rise up of public anger, the demonstrations, that he actually compromises on that front? Is there any suggestion that there may be room for compromise now?
There isn't. Netanyahu is an ideologue, and the past has taught us that, especially under public pressure, he would not back down on something like this. He has described, indeed most Israelis consider this war an existential war, not just against Hamas, but other Iranian-backed groups in the region that are sworn to Israel's destruction. Now, the Philadelphia corridor, as you know, as our viewers may know, is a strategic area that controls the southern Gaza Strip border with Egypt. Israel says it must retain control of this in order to prevent a rearming and a potential regrouping of Hamas under any truce. Hamas, with backing from Egypt, has said Israel must vacate this corridor. So it would appear that this is one dispute that is holding up those truce talks. But again, there's a deeper dispute here, which is that Hamas wants a truce essentially to lead to an end of the war, a unilateral end of the war by Israel against it, a survival of Hamas in power potentially, and potentially returning to its original military strength. Israel has said from the outset of this war launched by Hamas that it will not stop until Hamas is dismantled, disarmed, and Gaza no longer poses a threat. So Israel, the government, Netanyahu, and it's worth remembering that this resolution was backed by pretty much all members of his security cabinet, with the exception of the Israeli defense minister. They say that this area must be kept, while some members of the Israeli military and the Israeli defense minister have argued that Israel can afford to back off from the Philadelphia corridor, at least temporarily, if that means regaining some hostages alive. I would just add that under the proposed truce deal, there would be a first batch of hostages released in the so-called humanitarian category. Those include women, children, and the sick and the elderly. And sadly, 3 or 4 of the 6 hostages who were found dead over the weekend would probably have qualified, so they would probably have gone free in the first stage of such a truce deal, were such a deal to have been achieved in time.
Yeah, well, indeed, the clock is ticking. Where does the pressure point come from as far as the Prime Minister is concerned? Because if he, as you say, seems to be resistant to calls from the public, as you also mentioned, his security cabinet seems to be on board with most of his thinking, with the exception of the defense minister. Where is the pressure going to come from? Is it the U.S.? Is it only the U.S. that can prompt Netanyahu to get this deal across the line?
I'm not sure that's at all true. The United States, in fact, there's generally been bipartisan support for Israel historically in the United States. The Biden administration has been publicly supportive. There have been behind the scenes disputes on which Israel has usually stood firm. It's worth remembering there is now a US election underway, and it's unlikely other candidate would want to rock the boat by making statements that would be seen as breaking rank significantly with a significant ally in the Middle East. So I don't think US pressure is specifically relevant right now. Netanyahu worries about the economy. He also worries about the strength of his coalition. However, unfortunately for those who would like to see him change course on Gaza or even to see him toppled, his coalition relies on far-right members of the political spectrum that, if anything, would want tougher action in Gaza and fewer concessions toward Hamas in any truce talks. So he would appear to be internally stable. Why today's strike threatens him, and it's worth remembering that his government is seeking an injunction against the Labour Federation to prevent this strike. It argues that really this is an illegal move by a Labour Federation whose job is to look out for workers' rights and not to meddle in wartime policy. If the strike goes through, and it's not yet clear to what extent the scale will be and how damaging it might be to the economy, that is something that could be destabilizing for Netanyahu. He's a free market economist. He prides himself on keeping the economy going in difficult times. So we will see during the course of the day.